This is an acknowledgement of country. We acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and community. And as I'm on Whadjuk country, I acknowledge the Whadjuk Noongar people who lived on and cared for over many thousands of years. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and the emerging leaders, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. And then I lead into a short prayer. I just lost it, sorry. And this prayer, I'm sure you know, but it's one of my favourite. And we used to always say it at the end of YCW meetings, I think it was. Lord Jesus, teach me to be generous. Teach me to serve as you deserve, to give and not to count the cost, to fight and not heed the wounds, to labour and not to seek to rest, to give of myself and not ask for a reward, except the reward of knowing that I am doing your will. Amen.
It's my privilege to introduce this third annual Cardijn Lecture. To the best of my knowledge, it is the third. The first one being in 2021 with the lay Venezuelan theologian Rafael Luciani, who presented his lecture on the emergence of synodality, the Latin American experience. And then in 2022, Cardinal Michael Cherney presented the Cardijn Lecture, and his was based on the book that was published later that year, a book written by him and by Father Christian Barron, which was titled Siblings All, Sign of the Times, The Social Teachings of Pope Francis. And now we come to our third Cardijn Lecture, and this is the first that comes from within our Cardijn tradition. I think it's over to you, Katharine.
Thank you, Pat. And it's my pleasure to welcome you, Alana, and to introduce you tonight as the 2023 Cardijn Lecturer. Alana Harris is an outstanding historian and a very generous scholar. She's currently a reader in social, cultural and gender history at King's College London, and a distinguished historian of modern Catholicism who's worked previously at Lincoln College, Oxford, and at Wadham, Oxford, where she also completed doctoral work. Her distinctive expertise within modern British Catholicism was forged in those doctoral studies, where she was looking at the impact of the Second Vatican Council on the devotional lives of English Catholics. That study was published as Faith in the Family with Manchester University Press in 2013. And she consolidated that expertise, particularly through a chapter on English Catholicism and the liturgical movement that's published within the Cambridge History, Catholics and the Vatican II Era, Local Histories of a Global Event. That's a 2017 publication. As you'll hear in this lecture, her approach to the history of faith and belief foregrounds the experience of religion in the lives of ordinary people. She works across disciplines as she considers the way the past informs the present in religious communities. You can see that interdisciplinary approach in action in her publications, as well as the ones I've mentioned. There are 6 other books. Most recently, the landmark publication of the Oxford History of British and Irish Catholicism. And that's subtitled very appropriately for this evening, Reclaiming the Lay Apostolate. Her earlier work is equally innovative, drawing on neglected source material, visual and material culture, to trace the ways in which believers understood their search for meaning. There's a very early article based on her honours thesis in the Melbourne Diocesan Journal Footprints that you might like to explore. And it's worth noting, I think, that Alana is originally from Shepparton in regional Victoria. Several of those around the screen know Alana already as a contributor to the international project on Josist Women Leaders. Some of us know her as a graduate of Melbourne's United Faculty of Theology and also in Arts and Law at the University of Melbourne. So, Alana, you're among friends, and we look forward very much to hearing your thoughts on reform or revolution, the English young Christian students and their pursuit of a spiritual 68. Please make Alana welcome.
Thank you so much, Katharine, for that generous introduction. Stefan's going to share my PowerPoint slides, hoping that the IT goes well for us. But it's a delight to be here. And this is this wonderful fusion of past and present, it feels to me, and maybe future too, sort of going forward. The article that Katharine mentioned in Footprints was some honours master's work that she supervised back in the day, and the opportunity to start to actually think about the English experience that I've been exploring and connections to the Australian experience is something that I'm hoping very much to be able to do in the coming months and years. So in his closing speech to the Second Vatican Council, Pope Paul VI delivered a message to youth which likened the conciliar process to a re-examination of life, a very Cardijn phrase. He exhorted strength to withstand the seductions of egoistic or hedonistic philosophies and urged young people to place their youthful energies at the service of Christ, who is genuine, humble, and wise hero, the prophet of truth and love, the companion and friend of youth. 2 months later, when young Christian student representatives from across Europe converged on Rome, including 2 Brits, Maurice Walsh and Kathleen Moss. And if you look at the slides, you'll see Kathleen Moss next to Paul VI in that photo. He reinforced this evangelizing commission to this strand of the Josist movement. He said, "It is up to you to bring the spirit of the council to your fellow Christian students and through them to the whole student world, to convey to others the eternal message," here we are, "of Christ in concrete terms of the present day, as an answer to the vital questions: what is man? What is life? What meaning do our purpose and existence hold? It is the function of YCS to form contemporary Christians whose faith, having survived the adolescent crises of faith, will become firm and well-founded convictions, capable of sustaining a rigorous apostolic life in a world intoxicated by scientific achievement, accustomed to judging only in terms of the immediate and the measurable. It is up to you to sow the seeds of spiritual unrest and to awaken men's minds. So I think if we can have the full screen share of the slides, that might be slightly easier for people to follow. But what's interesting from this particular quotation, I think, is this very specific linking of the council impetus to the YCS movement, and indeed an encouragement to sow the seeds of spiritual unrest. I find that sort of quite extraordinary as an exhortation. At the more local level and contemporaneous with this papal commendation, the Bishop of Salford likened the English YCS to ferment, or the yeast in the bread, by helping students to be aware of the role of the laity. Addressing a movement founded in Britain before the Second World War for Catholic girls, and then numbering over 6,000 students, mostly school children, especially girls aged 14 to 17, and in convent schools, I'm finding, but also some more recently joined university students with the expansion of higher education to English Catholics. Bishop Holland called on the YCS to be a genuine embodiment of the council in these days of youth, as you have a special obligation to help others interpret the council's decrees at what Bishop Holland called a learning level. This presentation explores the ways in which the English branch of this international movement communicated its understanding of the apostolate of the laity before and after the council, and captured the spirit of the 60s in their creative responses to the social gospel and student power. Drawing upon these young people's theological reflections, committee reports, letters, illustrations, and training programs, new agendas and actions under the banner of the Council come into view. Crucially, this case study illuminates the internationalist vision, and one that, while emanating from the imperial metropolis, brought the developing world, especially decolonizing Africa and radicalized South America, into contemplation and sometimes even directly into conversation. As the bishop in the Mancunian heartland of the movement surmised, close attention to the YCS as the conciliar learning level opens out for the historian new questions about the reception of the council, and I think most importantly, and maybe linking with your previous Cardijn lectures, forgotten experiments with synodality with potential applicability today. So if I can have the next slide, thanks, please. Drawing upon Dries Boschart's exploration of the redaction history of Gaudium et Spes, that conciliar document, important conciliar document, which in his article charts the tensions between the incarnational and eschatological tendencies in its evolution, a study of the English YCS, and I'm using English quite particularly because there was an absence of the Jossist apostolate in Wales, Scotland, and Ireland until the late 1960s and early 1970s. So this English YCS offers an illuminating illustration of these visions of Christian anthropology in application, this more incarnationalist theology that was emerging from Gaudium et Spes. Early movement publications and inquiry programs, like a termly curriculum set by the London headquarters in consultation with young student section leaders, but I'm sure those gathered know about inquiries. These inquiries drew heavily upon the Eucharistic sacramentality of Pius XII's Mystici Corporis Christi. These visions of the church as the body of Christ resonated with a movement that was already moving beyond scholastic and more clerically directed understandings of Catholic action, as the See, Judge, Act program materials mobilized liturgically progressive theologies. And I've given you some examples of the reading material that was within these programs that went through. And for those that are familiar with Gerald Van's work, Carol Hauslander's work, you start to see a really creative, incarnational interrogation and application of the mystical body. So on the cusp of the council, in 1961, an inquiry program on apathy still drew upon these mystical body metaphors, but pushed them further through biological imagery around active cells in the limbs of a body to proclaim, we are Christ's body in the world, and any Christ-like impact on the world has to be made by us. He uses our hands, our minds, our wills, at work, in leisure, in meeting others, in home life. Next slide, please. Nevertheless, the involvement of key English YCS in the World Laity Congresses of 1951 and 1957 in Rome, especially around Mildred Neville, who's in the centre of the slide, who was the foundational director of the YCS from 1946, commonly known as Millie. I'm doing lots of oral histories with people who knew her, and Mildred, she never sort of goes by, it's always Millie. This involvement around the World Laity Congresses and this sort of key woman at the centre of the foundations of the movement meant that really updated understandings of the lay apostolate with a more imminent stress on the kingdom of God were also beginning to circulate within the organisation. Moreover, giving it central orientation around Cardijn's See, Judge, Act methodology, the YCS anticipated the stress on the laity's vocation, outlined in Chapter 4 of Lumen Gentium, and it was an example of like-to-like apostolate in a given social milieu, as prescribed in sections 12 and 13 of the Decree on the Apostolate of the Laity. From more tentative references in 1961 training materials to world affairs, and these world affairs that you start to see in 1961 training materials encompass Romanian resistance movements, the campaign for nuclear disarmament. They talk about Chinese refugees and Congolese rebels. So from these set of tentative namings of social issues that students should talk about, they begin to flourish into a sort of a more sustained inquiry in 1963 on apostolicity and indeed the student world. So you're starting to see a movement from around 61 into something that's much more reflexive, that is beginning to expressly dialogue with the council. These structured inquiries with supporting biblical references, of course, so that use of scripture, again, preceding its increased importance coming out of the council, included prompts to self-critique. And you start to see references to the decree on the apostolate of the laity within these YCS materials to start to inventory the organisation itself. They begin to ask whether their meetings were unduly inward-looking, whether they were unduly middle class, whether they were insufficiently responsive to the situation of immigrants from decolonising Commonwealth countries. And these are very tentative beginnings. Some of these prompts to 14-year-old, 16-year-old Catholic girls in particular ask about whether there's a Black student that is isolated at school, for example. So you start to see, but at least there's something of an increasing awareness of thinking about the changing complexions of Britain, and indeed a responsibility to start to respond to these signs of the times around the emergence of racism in British society. Next slide, please. So the impetus in materials towards a more global orientation around issues of educational literacy and the establishment of a cadre of young leaders in former British colonies can be dated from around 1957, with the appointment of an overseas secretary. And as part of this role, the assumption of express responsibilities for Africa and planting the YCS in Africa. Around the beginning of her career as a home economics teacher in secondary schools, and then a graduate at the London School of Economics, Frida Marnie authored a YCS for Africa handbook, which opened with a quotation from Pius XII on the apostolate. And within this handbook, she crafted induction materials for predominantly Nigerian school children, explaining the doc method, providing scriptural reflections, and offering, which I think is fascinating, detailed scenarios that offer gentle reflections for actions to address tribalism in Nigeria, which was, of course, increasingly beginning to emerge as an issue in the 1950s. In what became the African secretary role, she maintained contacts with missionary priests and YCS student leaders, such as Gertrude Fonjoy in Cameroon. She encouraged UK extension workers in other parts of the continent, like Agnes Bray, who taught in Uganda, and Kath Marnie in Ghana, and Peter McBride in Malawi. And she became the movement's expert on African affairs at the invitation of the Catholic Secretariat in Lagos, which asked her to help develop and coordinate the movement on the ground between 1963 and 1966. And of course, 1966 is a very important date in Nigerian history, sort of thinking about the beginning of the Biafran War. And Frida Marnie talks about effectively just getting out before everything starts to really fall apart there. The unique expertise and transnational networks of the international YCS across other youth concerns, such as teenage culture and sexuality, were also increasingly recognised by international organisations such as UNESCO. Staffordshire section leader Kath Moss, who we saw in that very first photo with Paul VI, was commissioned in 1964 by the International YCS headquarters to use student interviewers in Stoke-on-Trent schools and the newly established Keele University to provide empirical and more honest evidence for the United Nations on the difficulties adolescents have in adapting themselves to society. That was the brief. Impressively, for a young woman who was still a teenager, Moss established links with a sociology lecture at Newcastle on Tyne to co-design a survey, and the quality of this methodology ensured its translation, the survey's translation, into other languages for deployment through the YCS movement, with teenage interviewees undertaking the survey in France, Belgium, Italy, and then presenting the final compiled survey to UNESCO. Next slide, please, Stefan, thanks. Into the late 1960s, against the backdrop of the Vietnam War, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and debates about birth control linked to famine and overpopulation, regular columns in the quarterly YCS bulletin rapidly became more internationalist and echoed Derek Lance's mobilisation in the magazine of Guardium Expes' Imprimatur. In a piece in the magazine in 1965, He asks whether, as an organisation, the YCS needed to ask more questions about the bomb, about hunger, about justice, about morality, and a host of other things, including religion. So here you have sort of this flipped lens about thinking about the incarnational vision and what a C. Judjak method would mean for answering these questions. The implications of this expanded engagement well beyond a school and college setting led some within the YCS, such as Ferdinand Sanan from Syria, to push for the movement to be even more outward-looking and to evaluate the balance between piety and action. A West African leader, Claire Gra, if anyone knows more about her, I'd love to know more about her, who obviously made an impression on the large English contingent gathered at the 1965 World YCS session in Lebanon, posed more provocative questions. Claire Gra said, "Are we just fiddling about at the edge of the problem? If we really meant to bring other students to Christ, wouldn't we be involved in the political life of our countries? What are we scared of anyway?" Next slide, please. Some within the English ranks were not the slightest bit trepidatious about mixing faith and politics, such as Pete Baldock, who studied history at Christ Church College, Oxford, and who served as the English YCS president in 1965 and its international representative until 1970. And these international representatives, I think, are really interesting too, including Pete's involvement in that. In an extended reflection delivered at a Christian Marxist dialogue meeting in 1968, Baldock opened with the statement that both ideologies share a belief in the fundamental goodness of man and of the universe and an urgent apprehension of present evil. His synthesizing comparison neatly encapsulated the optimistic incarnational anthropology of the immediate post-conciliar movement, as evidence in this synoptic survey of convergence and difference. As he put it, "Christianity is a revolutionary doctrine. It proclaims the possibility of a human society of perfect love and freedom, and therefore the need to reject the society of the present era in which these are impossible. Unlike Marxism, it proclaims this hope on the basis of a set of historical events, the life of Christ, rather than a scientific theory of history. Unlike Marxism, it relates this possibility of love and freedom to the nature of being. This raises important ethical questions as to how far the perfect society must be worked for and how far it is to be determined and need only be witnessed to and shared in. For both Marxism and Christianity, the understanding of man is humanist. If a man loves God but hates his brother, he is a liar." Next slide, please. And just to say, I've been inventorying the Slant magazine, the publications that were Christian Marxist magazine based in Oxford and Cambridge from 65 to 71 that people like Terry Eagleton were involved in too. And you find traces of Pete Baldock in that publication as well. So really interesting for these sort of young first in family Catholics at the established old universities who are beginning to try to sort of think about meshing their faith with interrogation of the world and the present moment. So these political currents, especially a reading of the signs of the times in the light of Paul VI's 1967 encyclical Populorum Progressio, framed English YCS conversations about Africa in particular. In a 1967 Q&A column in which Chris Bester quizzed an Oscott Seminary sociology lecture about the encyclical, readers were reminded of the role of the YCS in helping people to the right attitude of life. We must feed the minds. We must help them to progress as people so they can take a responsible part in the world community. For a section of the movement, however, this reformist and residually paternalistic missionary approach no longer sufficed. As Roger Klein posed in a 1969 essay citing the New Left activist Robert Blackburn and Trotskyist Ken Coates, when adjudicating the question of reform or revolution, and this is my presentation title, of course, the foundational questions return to, for Roger Klein, the exploitation of labour at the heart of capitalism. By the late 1960s, many within the English YCS recognised that the scale and landscape of this analysis and action must be global and necessarily acknowledge the legacies of colonisation. For English YCS delegates involved in the 1967 World Session in Montreal and the World Assembly of Youth, which many in the British establishment thought was a communist front, actually. Such recent graduates as Sheila Cronin, Liz Crook, and Cynthia Singh, who's on the slide and who I hope to speak to next week, actually, and Roger King, regularly critiqued problems through the lens of underdevelopment, of poverty, and interestingly, tentatively, female emancipation. So feminism's not quite finding its way into the evaluatory optic. Because, as they put in these publications, these issues could no longer be seen in a vacuum, but must be seen in relation to others. And because TV and films, they said, widen our horizons. Even more importantly for the English YCS, in contrast to the greater appetite for more abstract conceptual reviews of life in continental jock groups, and the magazine's absolutely fascinating, it gives an extended dialogue about what it describes as cavalry battles on hobby horses. And it has this humorous skit about the French and the German jock becoming very abstract and conceptual about their reviews of life, as opposed to the practical, grounded, middle way English YCS. So for the English YCS, these reviews of life were personal exchanges and working friendships, and they were increasingly mediated through an appetite for working across national boundaries, especially in a European setting. And all of these inquiries were increasingly structured away from these more sort of thematic apathy surveys into something that was much more experiential and much more inductive into the mid to late 1960s. Next slide, please. From its vantage across the English Channel, YCS watched, but also experienced through its staff seconded to the parish head office, the Episcopal silencing of their French sister organisation, GEC and GEF, in their refusal to capitulate to the bishop's demand for an abstention from politics. A 1967 newsletter reported on the student riots against the Franquist regime in Spain and deployed apocalyptic frameworks drawn from the Book of Revelation, with its logic of violence as necessary for the inbreaking of the New Jerusalem, to evaluate the liberation theology of Helder Camara and Camilo Torres, to applaud the anti-apartheid pastoral witness of Archbishop Dennis Hurley, and to resource a damning critique of European colonialism, to conclude, our present order must go and a new one be created. So here we have a really sort of close, intense interrogation of all of the very heady political happenings of 1967 onwards. Next slide, please. The YCS also adopted some of the public protest methods of the wider student movement, as did young Catholics who were perturbed about Humanae Vitae. And these young Catholics who have written about elsewhere, for example, to protest the banning of contraception, organised a sit-in in Southwark Cathedral to support a censored priest, for example. YCS groups in the north of the country organised a teach-in at the University of Sheffield Chaplaincy in January 1968 with a focus on underdevelopment. Others advocated ecumenical collaboration across the school student population and in concert with universities to work to secure, for example, an increase in British overseas aid. To this end, Letchworth schoolgirl Anne Cope advertised her FCJ convent school's climax action, which is what they called these sort of ends of a 10-week inquiry program, as a rally with banners in Trafalgar Square to protest the lack of publicity and attention to the plight of starving people on television. In a tellingly understated brief note, the Bulletin also quietly reported on a few YCS attending in a private capacity a peaceful march on October the 27th in London, 1968, which was, of course, the iconic 60s Vietnam moratorium rally at which over 30,000 students marched from Trafalgar Square to the American Embassy in Grosvenor Square, with police violence escalating. It seems that some of the English clergy were also transformed in their accompanying role as chaplains to YCS sections. Reverend Father M. Collins, writing in March 1968, sought secular analogies to describe the grassroots activism he'd witnessed over the last 3 years. As he said, and this is on the screen, if someone asked me after all of this to define YCS, I would probably use the words pressure group, even though I think it is essentially unchristian to pressure others. YCS members should be so enthusiastic about the whole of life as they see it presented by Christ, with its tremendous problems, that they should be capable of transforming society radically, showing the power of God is still present in this world to accomplish good and to bring to all men that good news which Christ died preaching. In this radical emphasis upon Christ's life, his worldly ministry, and the biblical witness to the kingdom, there was also an implied engagement with the decree on ecumenism. While the YCS had, since its foundation, nominally been open to non-Catholics, hence the young Christian nomenclature, in its structures and composition across its lifespan, it remained a mostly Catholic organisation. Alongside plans to extend the YCS into newly established comprehensive schools, he was still there, comprehensive schools, drawing on pilots in Scotland, Norwich and Stoke, it formed a commission on ecumenism with Council Peritus Bishop Christopher Butler appointed as chaplain, and aimed to, and I quote, spearhead the ecumenical movement among students by eliminating denominationally exclusive language. And into the 1970s, it worked with the British Council of Churches on the Northern Irish Troubles. In 1971, it took the audacious and unprecedented decision to appoint as national co-chaplain Wigan United Reformed Church minister Robert Kemble. So you start to see also sort of amongst this youthful population an appetite and indeed embrace of grassroots ecumenism. Next slide, please. Conversations and collaborations across the student milieu with other Christian organisations, such as the Evangelical Protestant Student Christian Movement, about which Sam Brooke-Taylor has written, but also more socialist and Marxist-orientated political organisations, and indeed with the countercultural more broadly, further radicalised the national YCS team from 1968. As Newcastle student Barry Say reflected, we, in theory, belong to a revolutionary movement. We are trying to change the world. The students are rising up. Berlin, Paris, Mexico, LSE. Sociological framings of international relations, strongly filtered through a Marxist materialism, formed the basis of an unprecedented and an inflammatory document, which I've represented the front page for you on the screen, produced as a result of this increasing identification with the eventual sort of elsewhere in 68 by the National YCS Politics Commission. Entitled Student Power in Christ and intended for the weekly summer school session at Belmont Abbey, attended by 5,000 students, this document, which became sort of quite notorious in the movement, opened with the provocative statement, "Student power has been a central concern of the young Christian students movement for several years. The 1964 events in the student world, i.e. the civil rights movement, the implications of our own positions and the influence of a number of our brother YCS movements throughout the world have led us to realise the need to situate the student struggle in this wider social, political and international context. In brief, we wish to restate the secular objectives of the YCS movement, which we see no longer in terms of a revolution in the student world, but of," and these phrases were really interesting the way they were passed, "a revolution, contributing to the necessary revolution in our society by action in the student world." So there's a resituate. Can everyone hear me? There was a comment that said people couldn't hear. Can people hear still? Yeah, great. So obviously this particular sort of inventory in 68 is thinking about, whether this is action. The student milieu is the school milieu, or indeed the student milieu is the world with students in it. The wide-reaching position paper adduced present-day paradoxes, such as the growth of UNESCO and the FAO, alongside the growth in the numbers of the illiterate and the hungry. But it also then interrogated the violent suppression of freedom movements encompassing Hungarian Czech workers, Vietnamese peasants, or American Negroes, and the role of education and new interpretive frameworks, including R.D. Laing's anti-psychiatry movement. So what we have in this particular sort of position paper that's coming out of this newly formed politics commission is an intense engagement with sort of the questions of the day, and this sort of intensely internationalist vision about Hungarian Czech workers, Vietnamese peasants, the civil rights movement, and indeed a critique of all of this through sort of the anti-psychiatry movement too. Next slide, please. Most controversially, paragraph 16 in this document linked student power to the Black Power movement and allowed that, and I quote here, "Violence may be necessary and justified in the struggle to bring the present form of our society to an end." The document was remarkably light on biblical citations and explicitly theological analysis, unlike many of these previous sort of summer school documents from the years before. But it concluded, "Our society, with its present structures, is incapable of permitting that brotherhood which Christ preached, which he exhibited himself, and which he said would be fulfilled partly in his church in the last days of the world, and fully in the new earth of the future." Subsequent reports on this 5-day session of 5,000 students in the Midlands provided more insight into the program. They were reading Kropkin, Marx, Debray, Marcuse, and the New Testament. And there were subject talks by Gregory Lomax, who was a sociology student at Essex, Stephanie Slater, who was a sociology student at Newcastle, and the headmaster of a London Grammar School, Brother Hilary. Pausing just briefly, I think it's really interesting that a lot of the university students that begin to join the YCS, they had their own university student movement too, but you start to see them being involved in the YCS. Many of them are reading sociology, the new discipline that's emerging to start to sort of think about the tools for a social science to critique society. From the archival traces, it's apparent that there was sharp disagreement elicited over the morality of liberatory violence compared to the peaceful but illegal acts of civil disobedience, and an extended motion on this proposition, which was another innovation. They weren't really sort of, these summer schools were not intended to be debating, deliberating, position-forming bodies, was not passed. On the distribution of the document in November 1968 to all YCS sections across the country, with a request for written feedback, very little was written in. Except I've been able to find one strong reaction, which is in the Archbishop of Westminster's archives. And this is from Sister Mary Champion, who is headmistress of St Mary's Abbey School in Mill Hill. She wrote an irate letter to the Archbishop of Westminster to denounce a subversive influence at work, which is changing the character of the movement, and to announce her intention to disband the YCS in her school. Next slide, please. The considered reflections of the charismatic and enabling national chaplain, Father Jack Fay, who gently shepherded the movement between 1955 and 1970. So you had this continuity around one immensely important chaplain who Mildred Neville found and appointed, and he was a history teacher at St Bede's Grammar School in Manchester. He gently shepherded this movement in what was undoubtedly a student-run organisation. It's really telling his take on this brouhaha in 1968. His erudite and wise commentary on the problem of political involvement, as he put it, published some months after the heated exchanges, included an observation that it is regrettable that the YCS is being characterised, caricatured might be a fairer word, as a communist-infiltrated society. Political involvement does not necessarily mean a dedication to Marxist theory or praxis. What followed was an eloquent demonstration of the role of the Old Testament, its model of prophetic witness as a measure for evaluation of contemporary social, economic, and political issues. Drawing upon Gaudium et Spes, Skilebeck's God, the Future of Man, Mackenzie's The Power and the Wisdom, and the witness of Archbishop Camara's martyred YCS youth chaplain, Father Fay confidently affirmed that if we are Christians in fact, not merely in name, then we must be involved in action which changes society and transforms it in order to create a society fully human and fully Christian. Nevertheless, he abjured the request from quarters unnamed to spell out explicitly a concrete program for political involvement, or at least clear guidelines, which would commit us as a movement to a certain course of action. His concluding statement, "I do not find myself able to do this," was deliberately and creatively ambiguous and perfectly illustrates the post-conciliar conundrums around authority, the magisterium, and a theological anthropology in conversation with an increasingly secularized society. And indeed, the demands that the chaplain should intervene in some part to adjudicate this difference of opinion amongst the YCS National Executive. Next slide, please. In what might broadly be characterized as an unresolved tension between a personalist compared to a more materialist and structuralist analysis, the English movement thereafter sought to find an internationalist position that struck a balance between global concerns and home agendas in expressing the students' apostolate. The World YCS session held in London in 1970, about which there's lots to say, and maybe people sort of on this amongst the audience know about sort of the 1970 World Session too. But this, from my gleanings through the archives, sought to knit together a form of Catholic internationalism that was vested in the local, but extended from that starting point to the developing world. It was a movement towards a more situational, contextual theology, as an explicitly Black theology did not develop in multi-religious Britain, unlike the United States. And it was perfectly encapsulated in an interview ahead of the 1970 London conference between a Miss P. McQuaid, who was a Reading University graduate, and Vincent Achinyu, who was a former YCS worker from Nigeria. In a lengthy Q&A, fascinating Q&A, and I'm just giving you a little extract on the screen, touching upon many issues, which included populist racist politics of Enoch Powell, the notorious Conservative MP, and the educational underachievement of Black pupils in British schools. Achinyu concluded, "It's got to start with the individual. It's no use an English man sitting in England, where, say, a coloured man does not have his full status as a human being, and doing nothing about that coloured man here, whilst claiming to be interested in people out in Biafra. I say this is the height of hypocrisy." And it's interesting if you sort of see, with respect to the sort of the London YCS publication materials, you start to see references through the material culture to zines, to sort of some of those other sort of totemic symbols of the movement around sit-ins and the like. So I'm wanting to do much more on London 1970 to actually start to really pass this pivotal moment in the English YCS life. Next slide, please. YCS actions into the politically turbulent and economically volatile 1970s in Britain, dovetailing with Mildred Neville's Catholic Institute for International Relations movement, which is sort of a spin-off from the YCS and starts to be where a lot of the students, when they become young adults, go, would start to actually link together a number of Catholic organisations that would start to work on homelessness, on immigration, on the Northern Ireland Troubles, on women's liberation, and concrete initiatives such as summer play schools staffed by students, on working class housing estates, or indeed local student agitation. I found it fascinating in some of the archival records to find, for example, pressure exerted by a girls' section in Slough to revitalise a defunct and much needed race relations board. So you start to see that there's a sense in which a lot of the action at local level amongst sort of school groups start to identify very concrete initiatives around decolonisation and racism to channel much of their action and think about the poverty of the 1970s that's re-emerging. This political pragmatism did not, however, satisfy all quarters. The 1971 National Leadership Team experienced a schism when three key office holders, all educated at a North London Lassallean Brothers school, resigned on the basis that to work in a Christian movement so very middle class and so very politically unaware, as they called it, would compromise their political beliefs. The withering of a homegrown Catholic socialist perspective through the demise of the Oxford Slant Group, the absence of an organised current of liberation theology in Britain, slightly marooned or mired the YCS and others who sought a program for power in Christ in more particular and practical initiatives that were much more grassroots and local. Nevertheless, back in 1968, the YCS was confident that their disaggregated structures and JOSIS methods could breed, and I quote, a new race of Christians who can accept their own responsibility in the Church of Christ to organise and lead themselves while maintaining the closest possible links with the successors of the apostles. As they outlined then, in terms drawn directly from Gaudium et Spes and paragraph 31 of Lumen Gentium, this involves reading the signs of the times and thus being, I quote, a prophet. It means acting with the authority of a child of God, and so being a king, and it means being Christ for the community, and so being a priest. Repeated references to both constitutions, then that Gaudium et Spes and Lumen Gentium in Pope Francis's newly published synodal synthesis and his November motu proprio, advocating for a contextual theology in dialogue with the smell of the sheep, seemed to me to actually point to the need to reanimate the legacy of the YCS in England and elsewhere as seeds of spiritual unrest that were sown by these lay apostolic organisations in the years of the council, and which actually, if recaptured and reanimated now, might find fertile ground in the newly synodal orientated church. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Alana. We have, yes, applause, I think, is already breaking forth around the screen in gesture, if not in sound. And we have a few minutes for conversation and discussion. If you'd like to ask a question, please use the facility at the bottom of your screen to raise your hand. Under reactions, you can raise your hand and that will bring you hurtling forward. It's much easier if you do that when we've got people across two screens. You can also, if you would rather, type your question into the chat and we'll pick it up that way and ask if you want to speak to it. Just while people are gathering their thoughts, oh no, already someone has gathered their thoughts. That's excellent. William, would you like to lead off, please?
Thank you. Forgive my ignorance. This is an area that's very new to me. My dissertation was on early modern Catholicism, so anything after about 1600 is a bit dodgy. What became of YCS? Is it still an active organisation, or has it sort of assumed other forms, or has it fizzled out in the meantime?
It's well, I mean, obviously there's an international dimension to this question. In terms of the English YCS, it fizzled out in 1984. It's sort of through the 70s, and indeed, Pat probably will sort of talked about being involved in the 1970s too, so we could bring Pat in. But it had sort of a sort of tumultuous 70s. At the end of the 70s, in fact, it was growing a little bit. But then my explanation for why, in part, well, there are a lot of reasons for why it sort of fizzled in an English context, but you also, at the international level, you find the advent of World Youth Days and the like. So there's a sort of a sense in which I think some of those sort of more localized sort of school groups look to that forum rather than the international YCS for gathering. But also, I mean, it's always intensely financially precarious, and its funds become sort of quite limited in the late 1970s. And indeed, you have a sort of a very different Britain sort of emerging into the 70s and the 80s. So it ceases. The extent to which I've been able to put this history together is because many of those that were formed in the movement and sort of have in decades-long relationships with each other as a result of the movement, gathered papers together and deposited them in Durham. And I think there was, again, Pat can probably speak to this. I think there was a potential attempt to reanimate it again a couple of years or so ago in Britain, but it's not come to anything as I understand it.
Direct cue to you, I think, Pat Jones.
Okay, thanks. First of all, thanks very much, Alana. It was just a huge pleasure. I'm sitting here with my husband. We met in YCS when we were 16, and it's kind of like listening to our life story being told, isn't it? It's, you know, Patrick, my husband, after YCS at school in Birkenhead, St Anselm's, went off to Africa to work in Liberia for a year as an 18-year-old. You know, and you kind of think, oh, that was his decision, but actually you realize there were all these things around that were pushing in that direction. I mean, my first memory of, I mean, we grew up, both my parents were YCW full-time workers in the 1950s, so I grew up in the Cardijn movements. But obviously not being a worker, being in the Catholic grammar school, joined YCS rather than YCW. But as a 15-year-old, I remember the experience of that there was a huge debate going on in my huge YCS section of a girls' Catholic grammar school, convent grammar school next to a boys' Christian Brothers school. There was this huge debate going on, and the people in the sixth form who were gods when you were 15, and they were talking about reform or revolution, and they were batting about interpretations of Corinthians where it talks about if the trumpet sounds an indistinct sound, who shall prepare for battle? And I mean, I'd never heard anyone quote scripture because people didn't do that. Catholics didn't do that. And I had no worldview at all. That, I mean, my worldview was blown open by this debate that I remember that these people who were doing their A-levels, who were debating whether violence was necessary to change the world. That would have been 1971. So it was obviously the tail end of the ferment of the 60s. I became a member of the YCS national team as a national schools president when I was 16. And at that point, most of the sections tended to be in the traditional Catholic grammar schools, just as comprehensivization was beginning to spread. So, and often, interestingly, they were hosted by, they were schools that were run by religious orders. So an awful lot of women's congregations, the Christian Brothers schools, De La Salle, and those were all the schools that had YCS sections. And the new Catholic comps, it was really hard to get into them because they didn't have the same chaplaincy, they didn't have the same ethos at all. And in fact, you know, I note with some shame that even though Seafield, my convent, and St Mary's, the grammar school over the road for boys, had a very active YCS, we used to look down the road at the Catholic Secondary Modern, at which so many of our peers attended. And I think one person came along who was the sister of a lad who was in YCS. But it was incredible how it had to exist within the kind of educational apartheid of the time. Yes. And, you know, I never came across a YCS section in a secondary modern, a Catholic secondary modern school, which I you know, I look back now and I didn't question them, but find fascinating. But one of the leaders in my YCS section was Cherie Booth, who was Tony Blair's wife. That was also interesting. And at one point we were banned by the nuns because I can't remember why we were banned, but anyway, we managed to worm our way back into having YCS masses in the school, and I was organising it, and we managed to get a young priest who'd just been ordained, who lived next door to one of the lads. He was called Vincent Nichols. He's now the Cardinal Archbishop of Westminster. But Cherie Booth read the gospel in a low-cut dress, and the nuns banned us again because we were not behaving very nicely. But on the national team, that we used to meet in Bob Kemble's house in Wigan, and it was very interesting, the ecumenical involvement. He later started a charity in London called Praxis, which has gone from strength to strength. He was a very radical URC chaplain. URC minister, and I remember the stress on Northern Ireland. I remember I remember inviting YCS members from Northern Ireland to our national council and listening to direct first-hand experience of what it was like to live under fire and with bomb alerts all the time. And again, I mean, as a 16, 17-year-old, it's literally, this is not an exaggeration, mind-blowing to experience this kind of thing. I think the decline started not so much when, I mean, World Youth Day was loads later, but I think the decline started as comprehensivization spread wider, and then the religious orders started pulling out of schools, and so there were fewer of the people who would be the kind of animating chaplains that would keep the continuity going. So even because it was student-led, like YCW, in fact, more than YCW, because at least people could stay in YCW through longer periods of working life. But in YCS, you were so staged between younger school years, sixth form years, and then going to university. And even the tertiary YCS movement was quite separate from the younger YCS movement, separate leaders, separate structures. And yes, we met, but they had a different world and different publications and things. So it's the school side of it, I think, very sadly diminished. And Alana's right, there was an attempt to get it going again involving Malcolm McMahon, who's still the Archbishop of Liverpool, who was involved in YCS when he was young, in about around either late 90s or early 2000s. But by then, so much of the patrimony had gone, so many of the chaplains had gone, and it didn't have enough of a strong trace to start it. Whereas, so I suspect by then it was tentative, and it was before the wide development of lay chaplains. You know, there's loads of lay Catholic chaplains in schools now. If some of them really got the hang of this, then they could restart it. But you know, there were very few at that time. That it was still priest chaplains, and they were starting to be few in number. So I completely agree that I would say there's never been anything like it in the school world. What you get now doesn't have any methodology. It doesn't have leadership development, and it's often liturgy focused, and obviously there's a big influence of the charismatic and evangelical youth movements, which fill the youth ministry space. So you know, it's picking up Stefan's
key themes coming up there, Pat. Key themes.
Apostolic, apostolic formation for apostolic action. You know, CAFOD is incredibly effective in Catholic schools, and thank goodness for it, because it does promote that internationalist. So I think the internationalist dimension of living Catholic faith in Catholic schools is extremely strong because of CAFOD, but it's not the same as student-directed worldview building that YCS did.
Pat, thanks so much. And I'm going to have to interview you and your husband specifically about the 70s, but that's been so helpful. Also I had a debate with, there's a lot of work, it's sort of a bit of a niche British history sort of question here, not so niche, I guess, in some ways, but the actual historiography around the movement from secondary modern schools to comprehensivization, which is huge in sort of the history of education scene, has had very little attention, and indeed thinking about what it means for sort of student magazines and student activities in comprehensive schools, and indeed some of the radical agendas that were happening in comprehensive schools around segregated schooling, under-attainment of Black students and the like. I'm wanting to join some of those threads up, but I'm very cognizant of the fact that you have sort of ghettoized movements, because this is very much under sort of the religious and sort of through the grammar system. So thank you for confirming that, and indeed sort of prompting me to do some further work on that dimension.
I can see, Val Noon, we thought that you were still at an Irish conference, but you're here. And you and I were talking the other day about how Vatican II itself is a movement. The YCS is clearly a movement. And I think the connections between joining one or both of those movements are pretty clear from Alana's discussion. I wonder if you've also put a comment in the chat. I wonder if you want to comment into the discussion at this point.
Thanks, Katharine, for bringing me in. I'm talking about 1965, 1966, 1967 in a suburb of Melbourne called St Albans, which was 90% overseas-born people, a migrant suburb. And we had the question of a lot of people from Catholic families going to the local what we would call here in Australia state schools, high schools, and with the encouragement of Margaret Whiting and Marg, whose other name I can't remember, and Gabriel Corcoran, who were working for YCS, I started this kind of after-school thing down at the local high school and invited the Catholic students to come and join a discussion group, which was based on little YCS handout, this terrific little discussion guides. And it just took off. You know, students love to get together, everybody loves to get together and talk about what's happening in their lives and review it in the light of Christian teaching. And it works. I thought that's about all I can say at the moment.
That's absolutely fascinating. As a Melbourne girl, really, sort of Shep-born but Melbourne girl, I know St Albans, and I can I can place that temporally and geographically. And I'd be intrigued to find out more about the materials that were being used, because I mean this is I'm sort of hesitant to go here because it's all very sort of sketchy knowledge, but I understand, is it Frank Sheehan, who was sort of out of the Ballarat YCS, and he was involved in some element of sort of racial justice, race relations materials in the late 60s.
Record, Alana, but that's out of YCW. And
yes,
it's later. It's later. I mean, he would be active in those years, based in Ballarat, as you know, an hour and a quarter or so out of Melbourne.
Yep.
But I'm talking about people who had no connection with anything like the YCW previously. It was very much a local thing, and you're pushing me to. How on earth did you get involved in this project?
Well, it's been floating around for 2 decades or so in some ways. I mean, Katharine ultimately, Katharine Massam, but
Katharine Massam, you troublemaker.
but
it's a gift to you, Val Noon, a gift.
But Alana, tell me how you got into the project.
Well, it all stems back to the doctoral work on the reception of the Second Vatican Council, sort of in the English Catholic scene, but having done a master's with Katharine on the Children of Mary and the Children of Mary sort of and what happens to the sodalities moving into the council. So I've always been very interested in lay organizations and movements. It's sort of the devotional, but the much more sort of action Catholic social teaching orientated as well. Educated by the Mercies and the Sister of the Sacred Heart and the Jesuits. So sort of thinking about Lectio Divina and Review of Life, all of this has sort of been swirling in the formation for a very, very long time. I mean, the Justice movement and the sort of the Justice Women project is obviously Stefan and Katharine, and finding mechanisms, and indeed Pat too, thinking about the English scene and the connections with the English Australian, British Australian networks. I mean, Val, your point about the YCW and the YCS is very interesting, because in the British scene, they are distinct movements, as Pat says, but they start to. There's a bit of a rapprochement from the middle of the 1960s, and they start sharing materials. They start coming to each other's conferences, and some of the personnel begin to move because the English YCS some of them feel that it's too insular and too middle class. And actually working more with the YCW would help them to be less insular and less middle class. So I think it's what you're pointing, maybe forgive me if I'm putting words in your mouth, but what you're pointing to is the distinction between YCW, YCS maybe sort of still being quite present in the 60s and 70s in Australia. But
Alana, can I just 2 quick points? We've got on screen Brian Lawrence, who will know the people I'm talking about. Brian, I think he and Montalto, a bloke called Montalto, worked for YCS in those years. But the other thing is you've got the influence of the slant group. You can't underestimate the influence of that, it seems to me.
Yeah. Publications are amazing. I spent a wonderful fortnight engaging with all of them in the Bodleian Library a week or so ago, and Terry Eagleton I'm speaking to in a couple of weeks' time, because there's a Wadham College connection with him too. But yes, I mean, it was so.
I was lucky enough to have an afternoon in Paul Rogers' papers. Did you come across Paul?
Yeah.
Back in the 90s on that group. It's a terrific development in English Catholicism, really. Yeah.
Yeah. Brilliant. Thank you.
Hey, Brian Lawrence, you got something to say?
Well, Charles Roux is in the queue.
Oh, sorry. Hey, Alana, we'll follow it up. Katharine Massam.
I'll
do whatever.
Alana will be here later in the year, and there'll be further discussion. Charles Roux, over to you, and then Brian, we'll give you a chance to comment if you'd like to. Charles.
Thank you very much. I see a huge distinction between the YCS and the YCW. I worked with both as a chaplain in South Korea, and they had totally distinct aims. The YCS group were focused on students as students. It was about their lives, their own sanity, really, whereas the as students, under pressure for working hours at school, many of them going mad, etc. The YCW were totally different. They were factory focused, and they were worried about the conditions in their factories and the wages they were getting. And so all their reflections and their actions was an ongoing thing about how they could change things within their immediate work situation. So the two had totally different dynamics. And I reflected on this once when I was working in Holland with Harry Haas. Lawrence Bright turned up, and he was pushing that educated university sort of pseudo-communist sort of program. So it was extremely...
You're mixing with danger and country there, Harry Haas and Bright, heavens above.
Yeah. But it was very political. They had a very political scene, whereas the YCW, as I'd experienced in Korea, was political eventually, but immediately it was to do with working conditions. So I see a big distinction between YCS and YCW. That's my comment.
That's absolutely fascinating. And I think the national inflections of these international organizations is emerging as something that's quite intriguing too. Because, I mean, there is this distinction about what the milieu is, of course, and how school is quite different or can be quite different from the workplace. But the connection with sort of the trade union movements in some places, and indeed thinking about the role of sort of slightly more abstract theory. I mean, Lawrence Bright and his role in the Slant Group and sort of progressive Catholics, so English Catholic circles through the Dominicans, and indeed liturgical experimentation is a really sort of distinctive hallmark, I think, of the English experience. So yeah,
the commonality that I could see is in the focus on formation of the people involved. And I think that's the important link.
Yeah. And the review and what the review means, but actually what's emerging too, and this would be sort of Stefan's sort of special subject as well, is the fact that even under the umbrella of the same method, you get different inflections in the method too, and sort of slightly more, well, at least from the English perspective, sort of slightly more sort of abstract, free-floating continental philosophy manifestations of it through the French and the German that they reflect on as quite different from their way of seeing, judging and acting. So
could I say
Bob,
something?
Yes, so Brian,
Sorry.
and then I see Bob has his hand up, and then Stefan has a question in the chat that we'll invite him to speak to. But over to you, Brian.
I was a member of the parish YCW from the week I turned 14, which was then the school leaving age, until I was 21. That's 1960 to 1967. I was active in the parish YCW, and I was in the leaders group, and had somebody offered me a job at the end of my last year at law school working for the YCW, I would have taken it. That's not how they did it then. They didn't offer jobs. You got elected by the diocesan executive, and I wasn't on that, but I was offered a job with the YCS and I took it. In our parish, which is a working class parish, students were in the YCW. In the Ivanhoe parish, for example, some people know the Ivanhoe parish, it was dominated by students. The YCW was dominated by students and tertiary students. So there really wasn't much of a difference between the YCW and in regard to workers and in regard to students. It was a parish-based movement. The YCS was restricted to schools. A decision was made by the YCS in the late 60s, or well, probably 1967 in particular, to set up parish YCS groups. There'd been a few established, but it was regarded as an objective of the YCS, and that was partly why they offered me the job to work for the YCS. There was a time in Melbourne when there were about 30 tertiary student groups. There are similar or more than that parish YCS groups, and they flourished. And Val Noon knows a lot about them because he was a great inspiration for a lot of us who worked in the student apostolate at the time. I think the collapse of both the YCW and the YCS had common causes, which perhaps it would be a separate discussion from the one we're having now. But I'd be Pat Walsh has got a suitcase full of YCS archives, which Alana, you'd love to see. It'd be worth a trip to Melbourne. He's been keeping it in his attic for the last 50 years or so, and he's got documents going back to 1947. It's amazing archival material, and you know, Pat, it'd be great if you could say something later before we break.
Okay, the queue of speakers is getting delightfully long. Thanks, Brian. Alana, you should respond.
Well, just brief, thank you so much for that. And the movement to thinking about what parish YCSs would look like is something that the English contemplate too. And it's not all that successful, but they do start to, in places where there isn't a Catholic grammar, and indeed you have lots of students in state schools, the comprehensive sort of system, or the secondary modern comprehensive system. Some of those parish YCSs work mostly sort of in around Staffordshire, and they feel like the movement suggests that they're a very different way of doing it as opposed to the school environment. So there aren't many examples of them, but there are a few, and indeed they start to ask critical questions of the national organisation and structures into the late 60s and early 70s, which I think is also interesting. The notion of suitcases of archives and being able to contextualise this in the Australian scene is phenomenally exciting. And as Katharine mentioned, I'm out again in July. I was out sort of in September doing some work at ACU, and I'd be really keen to chat to folk and see some documents if they're available.
Bob, do you want to chime in here? Bob Wilkinson?
Am I on air?
You are.
I am, I think. But just putting on record, my family started YCS in Adelaide in 1945, and I became a priest in 55 with YCS. And I think from 45 to 65, at least in Adelaide, and I suspect Australia generally, YCS was not a movement. It was essentially a school organisation started by the bishops who did lots of good work. It was essentially a kind of at its best, a gospel discussion and good deeds, parody sometimes is picking up papers in the schoolyard. But there was quite a startled experience. First full-timer came in Tony Regan, I think, somebody could correct me here, about 68, 69. And the first 20 years, there was not a trace, and somebody could correct me, at least in South Australia, totally controlled by, for the best of intentions, by the sisters and an occasional parish curate involved, but totally not unmovemented. Kevin McDonald, the future international secretary, said the most remarkable thing about the YCS movement until the late 60s in Australia, and obviously this could be counterfacted, but generally speaking, it was not a movement, it was a church organisation. And it was the students who really established it, I would suggest, from 65 onwards, gradually searching to become a student movement. Would anybody like to comment on that?
Yeah, I'm up for a comment on that, Bob.
Val, yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I go with you generally. I was at a group at the De La Salle College in the 52 to 50 sort of 5 or 6 period. What I would say in defence of the YCW then is that it taught you to think that where you are now is a place to think about what you do for Christianity. Don't just think what are you going to do in later life. It did encourage us to think of what we're doing as students. It seems to me we had a bloke called Brian Burke. You remember Bob Wilkinson?
He was national chaplain.
Yeah, he addressed us at a YCS summer school or whatever, and I can remember, but memory's a funny thing, but I might have a note on this one. that he actually said, don't just think what you're going to do in the future, think about what your vocation is now. So it did have, it's very much what you said about the YCS, but it did have that aspect of encouraging young people to think about themselves as having a role in society right then and there. Did you agree with that?
Yes, Berkey was most exceptional. He led a revolution. The international contact was almost totally absent from YCS. That kind of thinking of political issues and so forth arose very suddenly and almost violently in about, I'd suggest 68, 69. But prior to that, I was a very dedicated parish curate in 1955, but there wasn't a trace of social awareness, essentially a one-to-one gospel reading, and it was very close to the prefects club. But this is not to deprecate it, the chances I am. It was the step for many people to YCW, and a lot of good came from it, and it did a lot of good. But that social level, that lovely address that we've just heard today, would have been a bit like giving brain surgery to the Boy Scouts Crusade group in my first years. And I bumped into the radicalism when I was always pushed by the bishops to be national chaplain to YCS in about 1971, I think.
Okay.
Stefan, you've got a series of important reflections in the chat. Do you want to speak to those before I ask Pat Walsh to speak to his archival treasures? And then we need to throw to Pat to conclude.
No, I think I've put my comments there, and I'd much rather hear what Pat Walsh has got to say. But I think I just will conclude with one comment that I remember Bob Wilkinson made in 1987 that really struck me, and I still remember it. And that was that the church has forgotten about movements. So, Bob, I think that was already a prophetic comment in 1987, sadly even more true today. And I think that's really something we need to look at. But I'd like to hear from Pat Walsh and others.
Yes, okay. Pat, there's a general sense of deep interest in your resources. I don't know if you'd like to talk about that or some other reflection.
Yeah, thanks very much. Briefly, hi, Alana. Nice to meet you, as it were. You're very welcome to have a look at this suitcase of material under the desk behind me. When you come, it's sort of looking for a home as well. Brian and I have had a few discussions about where to, whether to digitise it, where to locate it, and all that sort of stuff. So that's still a moot question. If anybody's got any great ideas, I'd be very interested to hear. Look, I just want to make a very general comment, and it's a bit heretical, actually. I'm not sure that YCS was ever a movement,
That's right.
particularly secondary YCS in the First World. It traces its daddy was Cardijn, and Cardijn, dealt with a sort of a third world issue, if you like, in the Belgium at the turn of the century, dehumanisation of workers. And that I picked that up very much from KJ Smith, the YCW chaplain, and I took it with me to the country town where I was appointed to my first year after ordination. And I applied it there because a section of the school population, day students, felt marginalised in what was largely a boarding school. And the town they were from was also in a mess economically. There was a terrible murder and all sorts of things. So YCS for them fitted that situation.
What year, Pat?
But then we had all the influences from international YCS, and particularly Vietnam War and Vatican II, and the really the anti-establishment hippie movement and all those forces that word work. And people like Paulo Freire, who made the important comment here in Melbourne to us that education was never neutral, and others like Ivan Illich, whom we didn't get to meet, but was also from that sort of part of the intellectual universe, they raised big questions about even the legitimacy of the education system. And so addressing those, YCS, I felt, became quite elitist because it was way beyond the capacity and experience of secondary kids. And we sort of, speaking very generally, we pushed that sort of agenda at the national level. I was involved there for quite a few years. And so I suppose all I'm saying is I think secondary YCS really had nowhere to go. I don't think it was ever really a movement. There were times when there was close engagement and some pretty big things being done, but it's sort of a lot of that was, despite what I just said, outside the school, and it always seemed to be looking for a cause. So, I just sort of wonder whether those sort of dimensions need to be looked at as well. I mean, I went to the International Conference at Maastricht in Holland, and it was a fantastic experience, but very heavy politically, very heavy analytically, high-level inputs from some pretty impressive people, particularly from the third world, who took it over at that point. And I don't think there were any secondary students there. It was never applicable to secondary students at that level, and YCS in Australia was largely only secondary. Yeah, there were tertiary groups from time to time and so on and so forth. And we produced some fantastic people. Bob Wilkinson mentioned Kevin McDonald, went on to make fantastic contribution Australia and internationally, people like Mark Considine and a whole lot of others. But anyway, I'll just leave it at that. Thank you.
Pat, thank you so much for naming and indeed articulating something of the ambiguity and the tension that I've encountered in trying to actually describe this this evolution through the English scene. In the early 50s and to sort of the late 50s, I would absolutely agree with your characterization of the YCS as being very much sort of in the shadow of the Cardijn and indeed YCW in Britain. And interestingly, I think it really was almost a Catholic Action-esque group that was very, very local and very secondary school orientated in the movement in the 60s that I've charted to thinking in much more transnational expansive terms and sort of beginning to really animate the connections with the international headquarters in Paris and indeed the European scene, and then from the European scene participating much more in these the World Assembly of Youth, which was a non-Catholic gathering of sort of 18-year-olds to sort of 25-year-olds, so those that are probably moving on to university, and indeed the movement of some of the Catholic students that were at university for the first time because of the expansion of tertiary education in Britain. I think it's probably fair to say that some of the movement that I've traced in terms of its broadening out its orientation and its much more sort of intellectual sort of heft and political orientation is driven by those that are the sixth formers that Pat described, and those that are the full-time workers that are just out of schools and reading sociology at some of the new universities. So there are tantalizing traces, though, about the extent to which, even though this is very sort of heady stuff, that it is sort of percolating down into the schools. And indeed, I mean, I find it intriguing that Father Fay will be reading Skilobex and Conga and actually distilling some of that down into a form that is slightly comprehensible, more comprehensible for a grammar school girl, especially. So I think it is true that the university students at the national level, the international level are the ones that start to really sort of drive the conversations, and some of the more sort of abstract analytical conversations, but the schools sections do come along for something of that ride in the 60s and the 70s too, and actually starting to differentiate around the youth there and the ones that are school students and the milieu of the school, and the way that then is inserted into these broader social conversations, and social conversations that are thinking about the British world collapsing through decolonisation and the arrival of Commonwealth migrants into Britain, is something that I want to trace much more, I think, in school magazines, because I'm hearing that in some of the convent schools in which there was a YCS section, there'll be little reports on what these little grassroots groups are doing with these sort of fairly highfalutin inquiry documents, and then thinking about how they apply them. So yeah, you've given me a bit more of an impetus to start to leave that against what I love. I love heretical questions. That impulse to actually sort of interrogate how grassroots this was as opposed to elitist, and to what extent you could say it as a movement. I think probably from the English optic on this, it does start to act like a movement. It starts to connect with other movements, and it's through, especially its European connections, which after all, if you're able to be on a ferry and be on the continent and exposed to a lot of that theological ferment and scene very readily, as opposed to being 22,000 kilometres away, some of that sense of being a transnational movement is more possible.
Thank you, Alana. I hope what we're witnessing tonight is the next step forward in quite an important flourishing of a research project that brings all of this into dialogue across the world. So thank you to all who've contributed to the discussion and all who've been here. It's my role now to throw to Pat Branson to conclude this evening.
Well, actually, I'll throw it to Stefan to close off. But on behalf of everyone who's participated in this lecture, I would like to offer a vote of thanks to you, Alana, because if you hadn't accepted that the role that you've played, then we wouldn't have had all of this wisdom and knowledge from around the world coming together in this one space. It's truly amazing. I entered YCS in 1974, not as a student, but as an adult assistant. And I was trained by students. So I learned from them. But the students I learned from were insulated from what was happening around the world. And it was only through the workers talking to student groups and schools that we became aware that the movement existed, or that YCS existed beyond our little school experience. And it went from local to regional, then national, and then when we had international workers passing through, we discovered that there was an international movement. And all of that is brought into perspective this evening. And so on behalf of everyone, thank you for doing that. And I hope that your work continues and that we continue to learn and grow from all the research that you're doing. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's been an absolute delight and a real pleasure to present. So thank you for the invitation.
Well, Pat wanted to throw to me, so I'll just say Merry Christmas to all and Happy New Year. And we do have a series of webinars in process of being organised for next year. Two that people here may be interested in is next year we're going to start a series on Lumen Gentium, particularly on its chapter 4, the role of the laity. And our first speaker will be a former YCS and YCW chaplain, Bishop of Darwin, Eugene Hurley. So he'll be helping us kick off early in February. And secondly, looking at more up-to-date things, also a couple of former YCS workers will speak to us about community organising. They're involved in the Sydney Alliance and the Queensland Community Alliance, Devitt O'Brien and Chantel Ogilvie. So yeah, look forward to those things next year, but thanks to everybody for being with us this year, and just have a great time the next few weeks and a rest. And you too, Alana, much appreciated for everything.